Good afternoon. My name is Anne Komaromi. I'm the acting director of the Center for Comparative Literature, and in that capacity, it's my honor to welcome you to today's public lecture by Professor Toril Moi, holder this term of the Center for Comparative Literature's Northrop Frye Professorship in Literary Theory. Northrop Frye founded the program in comparative literature at the University of Toronto in 1969. That program led to the founding of the Center for Comparative Literature a few years later, and we're proud to have been the first home for the discipline in Canada. The visiting professorship was set up early on in Frye's name. It has been occupied by many eminent theorists who reflect in their own ways the commitment to theory and criticism Frye embodied. These visitors need not align themselves with Frye's name or vision, of course. After all, as Frye reportedly told Frederick Jameson, "It doesn't matter how often I'm mentioned by other critics. I form part of the subtext of every critic worth reading." Like Frye, all of the holders of the Frye Professorship think about the broad theoretical concerns of literature and culture. They challenge us to consider again how and why we develop our theoretical perspectives and what theory might be and what it might do. I'm pleased to welcome Toril Moi to this position today. She is the latest in a long and distinguished list of theorists, ranging from Jameson and Paul Ricoeur to Julia Kristeva and Derek Walcott. More recent visitors have included Rita Felsky and Catherine Malibu, among many others. After reading a statement honoring the land on which this event is taking place, I will ask my colleague, Professor Barbara Havercroft of the Center for Comparative Literature and the Department of French, to introduce our visiting professor today. We acknowledge this sacred land on which Emmanuel College, Victoria College, and the University of Toronto operate. It has been a site of human activity for many thousands of years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to study, live, love, and work in the community on this territory. As we do so, we seek to be mindful of broken covenants and the need to strive to make right with all our relations. Professor Havercroft, I'll invite you to please come to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce Professor Toril Moi, our current Northrop Frye Professor in the Center for Comparative Literature. Professor Moi is the James B. Duke Professor of Literature and Romance Studies at Duke University, where she's also a Professor of English and Theater Studies, in addition to being the Director of the Center for Philosophy, Arts, and Literature. During her illustrious career, she has devoted her research to, I found, 6 main areas of interest: Wittgensteinian perspectives on literary theory. Secondly, the work of Simone de Beauvoir as it intersects with literature and philosophy. Ibsen's late style in the context of the emergence of early modernism. Fourthly, women's writing, feminist theory, and the enduring relevance of both today. Fifth, contemporary literary works which do not adhere to the generic norms of fiction, memoir, or autofiction, such as British writer Rachel Cusk's Outline trilogy and Canadian writer Sheila Hetty's How Should a Person Be? And finally, Norwegian literature and culture in the 1950s. After her graduate studies in Comp Lit at the University of Bergen, she taught at the universities of Trondheim, Cambridge, Oxford, and Bergen, and was then appointed a professor of literature and romance studies at Duke in 1989. Before briefly commenting on some of her groundbreaking publications, I should mention that Professor Moi has presented approximately 500 invited lectures in 29 different countries since 1979, so we're about to hear a very experienced public speaker. Not only that, but in 2018 she was selected by the national Norwegian newspaper, I will try and pronounce it, Dagbladet, as one of Norway's top female public speakers, one of 12 of them. The other 11 women were politicians, comedians, and businesswomen. Professor Moi's list of publications is very long and impressive indeed, so I'll provide you just with a few main highlights here and refer you to her informative and thankfully user-friendly website for further details. In addition to a significant number of books in Norwegian, many of which were published by the National Library in Oslo, Professor Moi is very well known for her renowned books on feminist theory, feminist literary theory, and Simone de Beauvoir. In 1985, she published the much heralded Sexual Textual Politics, Feminist Literary Theory, in which she contrasts the more empirical Anglo-American feminist writings with the more theoretical texts of French scholars such as Hélène Cixous, Luce Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva. I cannot overstate the enormous influence this book had on myself, a Ph.D. student at the time, an entire generation of young women, and some men who were studying literature and literary theory in the mid-1980s. Graduate literature courses at that time featured a veritable smorgasbord of theoretical approaches to the literary text, ranging from structuralism, semiotics, psychoanalysis, philosophy, deconstruction in particular, but feminist and gender theories were not very frequently on the menu at that point. And this situation changed after the publication of Sexual Textual Politics. Professor Moi's trailblazing book, which I can recall purchasing with enthusiasm at the now defunct Toronto Women's Bookstore, became an essential addition to all of our personal libraries and to university libraries worldwide. Further important feminist publications include her French Feminist Thought, a Reader in 1987, and Simone de Beauvoir, The Making of an Intellectual Woman in 1993. This book was translated into 6 languages, including French, and the French edition has a wonderful preface by Pierre Bourdieu. In 1999, she published the influential volume What is a Woman? And Other Essays, followed in 2005 by Sex, Gender, and the Body, the student edition of What is a Woman? Pursuing her love for theater and for Ibsen's work, Professor Moi then published Henrik Ibsen and the Birth of Modernism, Art, Theater, and Philosophy. This was in 2006, a superb study which was awarded the MLA's prestigious Aldo and Jeanne Scaglione Prize for outstanding work in contemporary literary studies. Her most recent single-authored book is entitled Revolution of the Ordinary, Literary Studies After Wittgenstein, Austen, and Cavell, which appeared in 2017, which Rita Felsky, one of our former Northrop Frye professors, describes as, I quote, a milestone in literary studies. In this highly original book, Professor Moi contrasts ordinary language philosophy with Saussurean and post-Saussurean thought, convincingly demonstrating the relevance of Wittgenstein and other ordinary language philosophers for literary criticism. Finally, I will close by mentioning Professor Moi's most recent publication, a volume entitled Character, 3 Inquiries into Literary Studies. This came out in 2019, which she co-wrote with Rita Felsky and Amanda Anderson. We are simply delighted to host the visit of this renowned and highly original scholar at the Center for Comparative Literature. Her talk today is entitled The Question of the New in Literary History, Wittgenstein, Kuhn, and the Advent of Modernism. Please join me in enthusiastically welcoming Professor Moi.
Let's see. I have to see this. You can still see me even if that's... Oops, what happened? What happened? How do I get back to... I should never have touched this screen. Press video preview for full screen. Oops. No, help.
Sure, let's see.
I should never have touched it. It was a.
We're
you don't
on the
want to-
projector, so
Yeah, laptop. Maybe no. Sort.
room. I think room PC is what we want. That's where we are.
But why? What happened to? Oh, now we're back.
I think it's
Somehow
fine.
you magically did it. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Sorry, nothing is worse than when people spend the first 15 minutes of the talk just tinkering with the technology. Can you all hear me, even at the back? All right, thank you. So thank you for those introductions. Obviously, it's impossible to live up to that, so don't expect this perfect talk or anything. But what you are getting is like absolutely new thinking that I'm working on now. So we'll see how this goes. So as some of you may know, because I sent the link to Anne, I've just published an essay on how Ludwig Wittgenstein and Thomas Kuhn can themselves, two paradigm-changing thinkers, can help us to understand how the new in culture and history comes about. Now, there's something very funny here, because I had the full reference next to that picture. Well, it's gone. But in this paper, the point about this paper is that it's open access. It is available online in something called Conversations, the Journal of Cavellian Studies, and it contains all the theoretical, philosophical discussions of Wittgenstein and Kuhn that I deem interesting and necessary for the, like going before this talk, but I still think I can give this talk without bogging you down in questions of aspect seeing and so on. So there should have been a reference there, but So what I do in that paper is I focus on Wittgenstein on aspect seeing and Kuhn's the structure of scientific revolutions. And my argument is, of course, that this is crucial work also for people in the humanities. There's a huge debate about all that, but that's my view. Wittgenstein shows that when an aspect dawns on us, it makes us see and understand something we didn't see and understand before. He also thinks that aspect seeing, so let me just say here, the aspect seeing is often connected just to the duck rabbit. But you know, the famous duck rabbit, one version of which you see here, is a very special kind of aspect seeing, because the one aspect, as it were, covers the other. When you see the duck, you simply don't see the rabbit. But Wittgenstein's first example is suddenly, I look at you, and suddenly, maybe I've known you for years, and suddenly I see the likeness of your face to your father, for example. And in that case, I don't stop seeing your face. So it's not like switching from duck to rabbit. So duck rabbit is only one case of aspect seeing. Just want to stress that. Aspect seeing is crucial for Wittgenstein, as I explained in that other paper, because it makes us see analogies. It makes us see similarities. It is essentially, at once he says, imagination, Vorstellungskraft, and it is reason, or that is Vernunft. So insight and imagination, philosophical thinking, and the capacity to have make imaginative connections come together in Wittgenstein's study of aspect seeing. He also, and to know more about that, that's in the other paper. But in parts of his work on aspect seeing, Wittgenstein also draws on Gestalt psychology. The ideas that inspire him is first the thought that we often, so the whole idea of Gestalt psychology, to be super quick about it, is simply this: you sometimes grasp the whole, the Gestalt, the outline, the figure. You grasp the whole before you analyze the parts. So to understand something is working from what you already know about the whole to find out how it's put together. That has huge ramifications also for our understanding of language and so on, which I still will not bore you with here today. So the other part of Gestalt psychology that really inspires Wittgenstein is the thought that the relationship between figure and ground, and that's what you have here, depending on what you see as ground and what you see as figure, you either see a chalice or two profiles, right? That can often produce. Now, that means, if you think about it, that if you shift the ground or the background of something, you suddenly see the foreground, which you thought you hadn't shifted, totally differently. That's also a kind of aspect seeing. To summarize all this, Wittgenstein gives us, in my view, the structure of perception of the new. And for Wittgenstein, to perceive something new is perfectly ordinary. We all do it every day. We suddenly see something. We say to ourselves, aha, oh, now I see what she did that. Thomas Kuhn, on the other hand, in his very famous book, shows that it's usually, he deals with world-changing innovations, things that change the sciences for hundreds of years and so on. But there isn't a huge contrast between the two if one reads Kuhn carefully, because he also quite explicitly discusses paradigm changes in small fields. Paradigm changes which change what those practitioners in some corner of a science do, but doesn't transform everything else. So even what Kuhn calls paradigm shifts, and I'll come back to what that actually is and what a paradigm is in a minute, can be local and small occurrences. So to think about the new, we can't just begin thinking about the world-changing new. We have to build on what we all know as perceiving, what the perceiving the new is, and then we can start asking the separate question, which is the question of importance, right? How significant is it? Will it get uptake? Will other people be convinced? And this is so that the question of what makes a new, so essentially, new insights are perfectly ordinary. I hope we all have them, and particularly if you work in a university, you clearly sometimes feel you see something new. Otherwise, it would be a dreary job, wouldn't it? So, but then what makes some new insights, some new creative efforts important, even world-changing? That's a totally different question. That's not about what happens in that flash of insight that you then work on for 5 years to work out. It's much more, what we ask about then is, what will it take for others to acknowledge this as new, as important? What will it take for them to begin including it in their canon, in their list of exemplars? I'll return to those terms. The underlying question then is crucial, and it's one that exercises Kuhn and which he can't quite solve. Well, he doesn't really think it's solvable, and I'll come back to why that is, which is, how do people actually become convinced that they need to change their most fundamental assumptions about something? Not just something, but something important to them. This, I hope you can see, is just as much an existential and a political question as it is a philosophical and scientific question. How do we come to change our minds? And do we? And this, of course, is of crucial importance if we want to work for change in our discipline, because you may have this most beautiful worked out ideas, but you may have no chance of uptake for reasons that we then need cultural history, sociology of culture, and all these things to think about. So that was just the background, which is what I worked on and how I got here and so on. So I am very interested in literary history as my form of history. My colleague Fred Jameson made the slogan, "Always Historicize," very famous. In his wake, several generations of critical theorists and literary critics have exhorted us to think historically. But I now add, without some kind of reflection on or concept of newness, of the new, we can't really historicize anything. For the concept of the new is grammatically connected, and here I mean in Wittgenstein's sense of grammar, which means the network of use and connections that build up meaning. So the concept of the new is not just connected to the old, but to a whole network of other terms: beginnings, endings, before, after, change, break, transition, transformation, and indeed revolution. The new always emerges from the old. Historically and conceptually, we would never be able to see the new if we don't understand the old. I mean, on the old, as it were, the existing paradigm is the background, that not just the necessary background for the new, but going further, which Kuhn does, it's the condition of creation for the new. You can't have the new if you don't have the tradition. You can't get a new paradigm unless you know the old one well enough to see where it breaks down, as it were. But the new isn't just a phenomenon of interest to historians. Existentially and politically, the idea of the new is grammatically connected to hope and to despair. Without the idea of the new, words like change, transformation, revolution become meaningless. To historicize is to set the new against the background of the old. To historicize is also to work with examples. It's impossible to historicize in the abstract, in short. So, or in other words, a historian needs an archive. So let me begin by telling you about mine, or at least one of my archives. And this is the story about how I discovered the question of the new. I will just tell it to you fairly straightforwardly. It's a kind of meta account of how I got to write this book, in a way. Because when I was working on this book, that's when I got interested in the question of the new. I began feeling puzzled about the very simple fact that contemporary audiences were more shocked and outraged by Ibsen's Ghosts from 1881 than any other of his more or less socially radical plays. I mean, Ghosts was the one that truly shocked everyone. Now, I could understand, I thought, why they were outraged by his previous play, A Doll's House. For that play ends with a woman leaving not just her husband, but her children too. And that's controversial even today. So what I couldn't understand was the vitriolic reception of Ghosts. So there you have my original philosophical puzzle, my why this question, as it were. Now, just to refresh your memories, Ghost is the story of how Mrs. Helene Alving, who is now a widow, stayed with her husband, didn't divorce, concealed his dissolute lifestyle for his whole life until he died. As a result, and I'm summarizing rather gruesomely here, her beloved son Oswald is infected with a hereditary sickness that will destroy his brain and turn him into a helpless creature. Oswald knows this but can't understand why, since his father was such a paragon of morality according to his mother. This is like allusions to the then theories of syphilis as hereditary and so on, but the word is never spoken in the play. Giving her mother a bottle of poison, Oswald asks her to kill him as soon as that breakdown happens. In the last scene of the play, Oswald's brain does break down. Mrs. Alving screams in despair, looks for the poison, freezes in indecision and panic. Curtain. The implicit reference to syphilis was, of course, shocking to many. So was the idea of euthanasia. The play insists that conventional morality can kill, but so does A Doll's House, right? So this was hard-hitting playwriting, but none of it seemed to me to warrant the spectacular invectives it provokes. Ibsen's friend, the German writer Paul Heyse, wrote that when he read Ghosts, he felt as if he was sitting in a charnel house full of dead corpses, incessantly smoking to keep the stench away, but still, even so, he succumbed to nausea at Ibsen's abominable mixture of uneasiness, horror, and disgust. In London, where Ghosts was first performed in 1891, the Daily Telegraph devoted an editorial, it wasn't even a review, but an editorial to this ghastly play. And they wrote, "The play performed last night is simple enough in plan and purpose, but simple only in the sense of an open drain, of a loathsome sore unbandaged, of a dirty act done publicly. It's no more Greek than a dunghill at Delphi. It's not artistic even, for it lacks the single and steadfast worship of truth and beauty. Morality, criticism, and taste alike must certainly draw the line at what is absolutely loathsome and fetid." And so on. There are a lot of these responses across Europe. I mean, it's quite widespread. So such responses then, they struck me as just over the top in relation to the play. So what was really going on? As I kept researching the reception of Ibsen, the answer finally dawned on me. In fact, many critics, including the one in Telegraph, had made the point quite explicitly. I had just failed to understand what they were saying. The Norwegian philosopher M.J. Monrad, he was a Hegelian, who wrote the year after Ghosts came out, spelt it out. But in fact, so had the English paper. He writes, "The time is long gone when one turned to creative works in search of what one used to call poetry and beauty, when one sought refreshment for the spirit and the heart, to be uplifted above the messy, tiring confusion of everyday life, to find a reconciled view of life. What poetry, like every other form of art, now wants to offer us is only what's called truth." These critics tell us what their criteria for artistic greatness are, but those criteria were so alien to me that I hadn't recognized them at first. They are saying simply that great art has to incarnate the true, the good, and the beautiful. The good is often figured as morality, for example, and thus offer audiences uplift and reconciliation. Given this starting point, when you divorce truth, this is what Monrad's saying, from the good and the beautiful, you no longer have art. It's just not, it's unvarnished loathsomeness, right? Of course, what that tells me later is that what is naturalism? It's truth divided from the good and the beautiful. That's why it's so Zola and so on. But when this sank in, it dawned on me that Monrad and so many other critics in the late 19th century were still subscribing to what I, drawing on Naomi Shaw's pioneering work, call idealist aesthetics. The kind of aesthetics that once upon a time, just after the French Revolution, was a radical aesthetics. It was embraced by people such as Friedrich Schiller and Madame de Staël. It saw the true, the good, and the beautiful incarnated in sensuous form in art as a way to freedom. The uplift that the late 19th century talk about was for Schiller a road to freedom, to make the soul free of its fetters, and therefore to be able to work for change. I mean, there's a lot one can say about this, but I say some of that in the Ibsen book. So this, what was surprising was that I was finding this aesthetic as the dominant paradigm for aesthetic greatness to last way into the late 19th century. In fact, Paul Heyse, the friend of Ibsen's, got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1910 because of his commitment to idealism. You can read the citation online, it's all there. But after 1918, it's sort of gone from cultural spheres. But it lingers on in popular culture for much longer. So I had simply not understood the Ibsen reception, the reading of Ghost around 1880, because I was actually looking for the completely wrong thing. I had been looking for debates about realism. And why had I been looking about debates on realism? Because the whole dominant paradigm about the emergence of modernism is that modernism was a response to realism, a critique of realism, and therefore Ibsen often got cast as a realist and not really a beginning modernist. But then I realized that that may be true for the next generation of modernists, but it is not true for the first signs of the emerging change that's coming in the late 19th century. So I had simply placed Ibsen against the wrong background. When I'd shifted the ground, he as a figure looked completely different. I had been beholden to the wrong theoretical historical paradigm, namely that if you want to look at what prevents modernism from arising, it's realism. But that's not the case, as you can see. That it does happen when you get to writers such as Woolf, who writes about, you know, the Edwardians and so on. You have, but Virginia Woolf and her generation, like Joyce, who learned Norwegian to read Ibsen, are standing on the shoulders of the previous generation who had to fight the many-headed hydra of idealism, essentially. So Kuhn thinks that a paradigm shift begins with a sense of a puzzle, an anomaly, a phenomenon that doesn't quite fit with one's expectations. For me, that would be the puzzling outrage provoked by Ghost. Kuhn describes the beginning of a paradigm change as a lightning flash, a flash that signals a gestalt switch, a change in the relationship between figure and ground, figure and background. And for me, that lightning flash was the moment when it suddenly flitted through my head. Oh, it's idealism, not realism. Then you work for 5 more years to figure out how it all fits together, of course. So particularly, it was very hard for me to grasp the implications of all this. The hardest thing was to grasp was this very simple, really, but alien, idealist assumption that morality and beauty, or let's call it ethics and aesthetics, are inseparable. That you can't have the one without the other. We see discussion of aesthetics very often because we live after the modernist revolution, both as critics and as readers. So we see aesthetics as very often almost a formalist thing. It's a discussion of form, it may be a discussion of certain aesthetic ideals at the most, but what it is not is a discussion of morality or goodness, let alone truth. So for me, I just had so much trouble thinking, how could sophisticated readers believe that if it was beautiful, it had to be good? I mean, for us, that's just, there is like a blockage in really seeing the world from that point of view. But if you don't see why it's so hard for them to change their view later on, as it were. And of course they didn't. They died off, which is different. My breakthrough, in a way, came when I realized that many of the critical assumptions, the critical responses to Ibsen that had so puzzled me weren't in fact staid, old-fashioned moralizing with no aesthetic interest. They were expressions of a highly sophisticated aesthetic philosophical tradition, which was then reaching its rather ignominious over-moralizing end. But it didn't begin like that. And still to this day, some of the more elaborate idealist reviews of Ibsen are more sophisticated than some of the rather crude, yes, it's our lives, it's our new realism responses. So Ibsen's defenders weren't always doing him as many favors as they thought, because they reduced him to reproductions of life, which of course then overlooks his formal inventiveness and so on. So I have used Kuhn's term paradigm, and I've given you like the story of why these terms are started to make sense to me in the humanities, in literary studies. Now, there has been quite a bit of debate about whether Kuhn's ideas hold for the humanities, and I'm not going to go into them here. My view is that, rightly read, they are most illuminating for our fields. Now, as you can see on the screen, the key thing is to really look at the definition of paradigm in Kuhn. Of course, his book was published in 1962, and this is exactly when movements of structuralism are peaking in various disciplines. And lots of people have, particularly in the 60s and 70s, read paradigm as a kind of closed structure, like a square, which then leaves open the question of how do you ever get out of it and how can this be history and so on, but that's not what Kuhn says it is. Now, he also had all kinds of afterwards and later writings and in response to all his various critics, but essentially I'm sticking with his first examples, which is a paradigm, he says, is the set of exemplars. It's the fundamental meaning of the word is shared example or standard example. For the ancients, the Greeks and the Romans, a paradigm or an exemplar is an exemplary case in the sense that nobody can dispute it. That's why Kuhn writes so much about science textbooks as the carriers of the paradigm. Because the textbook teach the new generation what's what in the field, right? You're not starting to argue with Lavoisier. You learn about Lavoisier. Well, that would be the history more like than the actual current present. So examples, exemplars, model cases, paradigma in Greek, exemplum in Latin, hadn't really been a philosophical term until Kuhn, except for a little bit in I think the Vienna circle, and Wittgenstein used it a couple of times, but en passant, in Wittgenstein there's no big theorizing of it, and every time Wittgenstein uses it, it means signal example or something like that. So, referring to the natural sciences, Kuhn writes that the textbook are built on exemplars. But note that the exemplars, the paradigm cases, are embedded in a set of practices. They come with a network of ideas about what lab equipment exists, ways of doing experiments. They're not free of a whole network of uses and practices and assumptions. They are embedded. So when you learn about the paradigm cases, you also learn about all that. And that's what a paradigm is. So a genuine paradigm shift then is the shift in, should you say, your set of exemplars. What is your exemplars? If you change that, you're changing your paradigm, right? On this, so that, if that's what a paradigm is, we obviously have them in the humanities. Not least in literary studies. Some of you are maybe as old as me and remember that back in the canon wars in the 1980s, we used to say that the canon is what gets taught. And I think that was right. The canon in a given field is a set of Kuhnian exemplars, the works we think that every student of that field should know. I imagine that there's a central set and then some more overlapping outliers that we switch around on. But it's like saying, you know, no self-respecting person in an English department who teaches modernism can afford to skip, I don't know, Joyce. And as long as Joyce is the self-evident, one of the self-evident exemplars, that comes with a set of embedded ideas about what's interesting in Joyce, how to read a complex piece of work, and all these things. And so that's what I mean by paradigm. And it's also very interesting for me to note that some of the relatively new fields in our disciplines have by now developed extraordinarily tight, very rigidly bounded canons. Just think of the theoretical text everyone thinks they have to teach if you are supposed to teach, I don't know, Introduction to Literary Theory. Well, I'm already behind in my time schedule, so I won't go there. Or Introduction to Gender Theory or Post-Colonial Theory. As far as I have, I mean, this is just hearsay, but any university in the Western world are teaching this pretty much the same text, with then some extra outliers from their own culture or country or something. In modernist studies, there has been, you know, for 20 years, an effort to blow open the very Anglo-centered list of works. So that's more diverse. But, and then you can say that there's been a more or less modest attempt of effort to revise the canon in modernist studies, but I'm not sure, I wouldn't say I know how far it's gone. So the list of subjects or areas that any self-respecting lit department thinks it should offer is also a set of exemplars, i.e. a paradigm. Nowadays, it's difficult to imagine a department that has no courses in feminism or women's writing, as opposed to in the old days, or no courses in post-colonial literature or African-American literature, at least when you live in the United States. In the 1950s, no such courses existed. Clearly, a paradigm shift has taken place. Every canon war exemplifies the struggle of the new against the old. And in a canon war, there's more to be said about it. There's also embedded ferocious defense of entrenched positions, foundational critique of substantial issues in some field or other, and so on. But paradigm changes don't happen overnight. The new historical change, efforts at transformation, is usually underfoot for a long time. So it's really difficult to pinpoint the advent of the new, particularly because when we live it, we don't know what's to come. This goes straight back to the question of what it means to historicize, and I'll come back to that. Jameson says we have to historicize in hindsight. I can ask about the emergence of modernism because I actually knew it was about to happen. What do you do when you are Baudelaire or Flaubert or Ibsen? You don't go out and write a poem and saying, I'm founding modernism. So how do you know that you're actually changing anything? So you can see that all my questions are sort of balancing between the literary and the philosophical. It's like in that area I just find that fascinating. In the very early stages of the emergence of, well, first of all, critics can't often, upholders of the tradition aren't looking for the new, so they will fail to notice it. Or if they notice the new, then it would be like with Ibsen, they will censor it as a failure to correctly implement the old. So, and that happens a lot in academia too. You do, I don't know, I write something on Ibsen, not on Ibsen, but say on Wittgenstein. And in the early days when I did this, someone would always tell me that I hadn't totally misunderstood, say, Derrida's points. And if I only read Derrida better, my Wittgenstein reading would be utterly transformed, that sort of thing. But in the very early stages of the emergence of the new, artists themselves may not fully know that they are in fact participating in a process that will culminate in revolution. But that's partly because after neoclassicism, every creative artist and thinker believe they're saying something new. Which one of you will write an article saying, well, I'm actually just towing the line, saying the same old, same old? No one does that. That's because de facto everything we create is new. But the question here is it the run-of-the-mill new, problem solving within the paradigm, Kuhn would call it, or is it the transformative new? And you can't, it's hard to tell because we actually live now and not after ourselves. So the question of how you find the new is actually super difficult and very interesting. And of course it would lead me to my end question, which is how can we historicize things happening in our own current moment? How do we pinpoint signs of the new? I'll get to that. But the ones of you who may be interested in the advent of modernism, I worked some more on how do we find signs of the new. Frederick Jameson, my colleague for so many years, he says we can only periodize, make, as it were, conceptual cuts in history in hindsight. Stanley Cavell says modernism arises when the tradition becomes a problem for its practitioners. If we want to detect signs of the new, we need to know what the tradition was, as I said, because otherwise, how would we know? Could we perceive something new without the background of the old? Of course not. So far, when I looked at the signs of the very slowly emerging modernism, by which I mean breakdowns of the idealist trinity of the true, the good, and the beautiful as connected. We could go into a kind of spiel here when you look at the fascinating 1890s. So naturalism is the true without the good and the beautiful. Decadence is pretty much the beautiful without the true and the good. I'm thinking Huysmans and some Oscar Wilde, Dorian Gray, for example. And what we don't have much of is the good without the true and the beautiful. That seems to be, that would be what, religious tracts maybe? But we can think about that. So I found, and this is where I'll skip very fast, I found 4 sort of elements, or I almost see them, I'm not sure whether they are stages. I know the culture wars must be are when the paradigm really becomes under explicit challenge and people begin fighting over it, so they come last. But I know also that ideal realism did last for some decades, possibly up to the 1890s. So I'll go quickly here, just because the question here is always, how do you pinpoint emergence of the new? And I want to say that, of course, these are from my examples and my archives. We may have to look for different moments, different things for our own archives and problems. Ideal realism is a term that I found in a Swedish literary critic's work. But this is fascinating because when I started looking around, it really did exist. There are lots of critics at that time who start saying idealism feels so worn out, but they don't they don't have a different horizon. They just they argue for more reality, more ordinary life in literature. Fewer heroines who sacrifice themselves by throwing themselves off cliffs or something. I'm thinking of The Flying Dutchman, for example. So they want the writers to turn to the ordinary and the real, but they don't. But they want the ordinary and the real to be transfigured, uplifted. They don't give up on any of the old views of art. But for example, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you ever have the time, you should definitely read Paul Heyse's Kinder der Welt. It exists in a lovely Victorian translation called Children of the World, and it is like a phenomenal example of ideal realism, which is it's sort of a pastiche on Balzac's Père Goriot. It's got all these characters, because you see, these are good people who don't believe in God. That's like the issue. But now, if I get sidetracked into the plot of Kinder der Welt, we'll never get out of here today, so I'll force myself not to tell it to you. So essentially, there's also someone, Mary Poovey actually wrote an interesting essay on Charles Reade, The Cloister and the Hearth. These are sort of idealists who want more realism. And then there's something that just has another question, if someone wants to work on this. It's like we always think of Oscar Wilde as an incipient modern writer, a modernist to be, as it were. But he preferred Charles Reade's Cloister and the Hearth to George Eliot's Romola. And his favorite novelist, who was that? Certainly not Henry James or someone like that. It was Georges Sand, who is a card-carrying idealist. And how do we square that with the ongoing cauldron of struggles over canons and paradigms in the 1890s? The British Ibsen Wars didn't just hit Ibsen, they hit Thomas Hardy. The attack on something like, on Thomas Hardy's 1890s novels were ferocious and very much from the same source. However, then we get Trojan horses. My example would be Baudelaire's famous essay on Constantin Guy, the painter of modern life, which everyone has noticed that he there introduces a mobile, fugitive, ephemeral notion of beauty as suitable for modernity. But what people don't see is that in that essay, he uses completely the vocabulary of idealist criticism. He talks about the true and the good and the beautiful. It's just that he forges new insights with these very terms. That's why I call them Trojan horses, these essays, because that the new is born, as it were, within the old terms. So that's one. Then you have what I would call the duck rabbits. I'm not going to dwell on Emperor and Galilean, because this is the bit of my manuscript that I definitely don't want to go into detail about. But what that enormous closet drama does is essentially, if you read it with idealism as the background, you yourself, you live in 1873 and that's what you know, it will look completely idealist. The reception will show that up to 1914 it was common to read this as just more truth, goodness and beautiful. The play itself is about Julian the Apostate, who wants to reintroduce the Greek gods into the Roman Empire after Constantine had made it Christian. So it's also about paradigm shifts in religion, and can you turn time back? How can we have change that goes backwards? And all these things. Fascinating play. But this play to me seemed to me to tear down truth. That it's so full of skepticism. It gives up on faith. It destroys. Julian is looking for the beautiful and the true throughout the play, and it leads to madness and death and craziness. So if you read it from the point of view of the modernist tradition, it looks like it's all there. He's destroying the old Trinity. It's coming along. Well, that was just not the dominant reading for another 40 years or so after it came out. So the question here, the theoretically interesting question, is what is it possible to see in a given historical position? And what direction are we looking from, as it were? What's our back? What is it we have behind us that informs our way of looking at things? Now, here's another duck rabbit, namely this painting, which it's William Quiller Orchardson's The First Cloud. It's from 1887. Now, this was based on a poem by Tennyson. It was, I'm not going to dwell much on that, but it was definitely, it's the first of a trilogy of paintings, as it were. It was a moral warning about the first steps towards female adultery, and as retrograde as they could come, except that if you don't know that, because you only know that if you read the first catalogue when it came in the first exhibition of this play. Orchardson quotes Tennyson and all this, but in actual, when you just look at it, and I looked at it after reading Hedda Gabler, 1890, which is, spells the end of the novel or the art of adultery in Europe. You know how Le Lys de la Vallée by Balzac, Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina, and so on, big novels of adultery, giving rise to Tony Tanner's fantastic book from way back as a key social aesthetic issue of the 19th century. And then you get Hedda Gabler, who essentially, in 1890, declares that she is too bored to be bothered to commit adultery. And this could just as well, when I look back from Hedda Gabler, is it not a great illustration to that? That's what I mean by, but of course Orchardson would have been horrified, I assume. So then the fourth sign of the emergent new paradigms are culture wars. That then it's no longer possible to ignore the new, I would say. When you fight over it, you're not actually ignoring it anymore. And the example there could be the Ibsen Wars, the Thomas Hardy. There are lots of other culture wars one could look at as paradigm defining or change, or as signs of the breakup of the old and the advent of the new. So then we will come to the sort of end of this talk. I hope to leave a lot of time for discussion, of course. So Jameson says we have to historicize in hindsight, but he doesn't mean to say you can't historicize the present. He just says that we still take up a position of a kind of imaginary hindsight in relation to our own time when we historicize now. Look at it, Jameson's postmodernism, work that he did in the 1980s that looks back maybe 30 years, 40 years, but still historicizes its own moment. So now I think that I am obsessed by the question of the new, not just because I discovered it by working on Ibsen, but my work on Ibsen was actually driven by a wish for a kind of paradigm change in how we talk about the beginning of modernism, and to get rid of the idea that realism is the opposite of modernism, since, as Jameson also says, there's realism in everything, including in modernism. So realism can't be a marker for a specific period. Each period handles it differently, would be my argument here. So I actually have thought for years that the field of theory, or what we call theory, stands in need of a paradigm shift. We need to blow open the canons of theory, swipe away the cobwebs of assumptions and procedures that still hold us captive. But then at this point, I'm sure someone will tell me, yes, but that's what everyone is trying to do, right? It's like no one's here to uphold the paradigm, the old canons and so on. No, you couldn't possibly be, because even in the way in which the university is organized. Isn't the very criterion we use for evaluation of new work in the humanities exactly that? The famous question, how do you contribute to the field? What is your new element, and so on? And here I think I will distinguish again between the run-of-the-mill new, which is problem solving under the paradigm, and the kind of new that challenges it. I'm not sure we are asking to be challenged as much as we think, even if we are very persuaded that we are in favor of critical thought. But do we want critical thought of the very foundations of our own critical thought? That's a question. So then I think, what should we do? How then should we deal with attempts at the new? I will come to this at the very end, but there is a real issue here, because we will likely, like Ibsen's critics, quite easily reject them as failed attempts to do the old. Like, you failed to do your, I don't know, deconstruction, that's pretty passé now, so I can say that. You didn't deconstruct it correctly, and if you say I was trying to do something else, maybe you feel you don't really know what you're talking about, you have to do a lot more work, and so there's no more discussion really. So are there then signs of contemporary paradigm changes anywhere in our fields? Remember that the way I use paradigms, it's not at all about only big overarching things that will change everything. I think different fields can have somewhat different paradigms. Theory and its subfields is a very complex case, which I would like to write about, but it's complex because there are now so many variants of theory, and it would be a book on its own. But my two questions, one is literary, and that concerns autofiction. Is what we now call autofiction, a label we can debate, right? Is it something new in literary history? Can we read it as a break with the long modernist tradition in which I include postmodernism? And aside here, would David Foster Wallace be a kind of duck rabbit, wanting sincerity and authenticity, but yet still being postmodern? Throwing it out to you all. But I have done quite a bit of work on Knausgård's My Struggle, where it's quite clear, quite explicitly, he sees himself as deeply dissatisfied with a certain kind of postmodern aesthetics. Some critics have hailed his work as sublime, but others have criticized it for failing to uphold standards of good writing, having plain, boring style, not having any imagery, none of that density of metaphor they were looking for, and so on. Some see it as hugely original, others reject it as just a very long memoir. So how can we decide on this? What would it take to... Part of the work here would be to find its contemporary companions, but also to choose the right background against which to see it. And I've already said the long postmodern tradition. But of course, Knausgård's own is a great admirer of Proust, for example. And Proust is a quintessential modernist, so where do we go with that, and so on. I think that the way to look at it is to go from a more local modernist position. Serge Dubrovsky, 1972, he writes in the 60s, 70s, and invents the term autofiction, but you only need to read 5 pages of any of his autofictions to see that he writes as a super formally obsessed modernist. What he's doing is trying to make his life into art, what Knausgård's doing is trying to grasp reality through his writing, to actually become real in his writing. So it seems to me that although Dubrovsky calls it autofiction, it's not all the same thing. These are things that I can't theorize this for you in the abstract. I actually have to go and do the work, and I've just begun, so I can't say all that much about it. Now, courses on literary and critical theory tend to be some of the most paradigm-bound, canon-ridden courses in the academy. Why are Freud, Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Althusser, and so on still the unchallenged exemplars? The one figure I've fought for 30 years to get more into the canon, namely Simone de Beauvoir, is sort of succeeding a little. There are more theory courses that now include at least a little of her, but it's not exactly, but it almost seems like she's an outlier because is Beauvoir a theorist? The interesting thing is that we call philosophers like Derrida and Foucault and Althusser, all trained in philosophy, as literary theorists, but we seem to have real trouble with Sartre, Wittgenstein, Cavell, and Beauvoir, who are also philosophers as far as I know. So why is this? There's plenty of evidence that practitioners of theories for the last 30 years, at least sometimes in the mid-90s, have themselves been writing reams on how theory must be renewed and changed, because there's something, they are chafing against the paradigm, as it were. But I've noticed at least one element that strikes me. There's a kind of willingness to just give up on theoretically substantial discussion, and instead what people do is they map the field. They come up with various mapping or discourse analysis or institutional analysis to sort of say where things are and what type of theorists they're doing. But they don't engage with the actual claims of the theory enough, I think. So sometimes I feel that may be caused by the fact that they chafe against the old paradigm, but they aren't quite willing to confront anomalies in theories. That would be, for Kuhn, if you look at anomalies and contradictions, that's could be the road. Either you resolve it or it's the road to crisis and therefore paradigm breakdown. But in any case, in literary theory then, I think, as I said, if we investigate anomalies and outliers, this could lead to crisis and paradigm collapse. So I'm thinking of these two terms as possibly overlapping, but I'm thinking of someone like Eve Sedgwick, who rather timidly, first in the late 90s and then in her book in the very early 2000s, challenged what she called paranoid reading, which also has been called suspicious reading, as the only accepted mode of reading in literary and gender or feminist studies. That has, after all, generated enormous debate. There's not so much debate against Sedgwick, who was very timid, I'm saying, in the sense that she was just saying, hey, there may be something else. Could there be something called reparative reading as well? That's not like saying, let's tear it all down. It's like just opening the field a little. That has created a ton of debate, and it usually turns on critique, which then, that is, should critique be the only, is that the critique understood as ways of reading that shows aren't just critical of accepted reasons and values, but politically critical, so that you end up with readings that in some way or other can see themselves as contributing to social or cultural change. This is, of course, hugely debatable issues. And I am interested here in, I hear my predecessor, one of my predecessors in these lectures, my friend Rita Felsky's work. I have, in some, at least at some points the reception of her work has reached culture war levels. There's been extremely hostile in some quarters, and a lot of the hostility has been based on a commitment to critique, which I then see that critique is actually could be the name of a pretty comprehensive paradigm governing relatively large parts of literary studies. This paradigm has its own exemplars, methods, ways of reading, which are said to guarantee the political and critical effects of literary criticism. But it should be clear that serious paradigm change, paradigm critique, is of course inherently critical of the old. It's just not critical in the right way for that paradigm of critique. So, I mean, I find Felsky's work to be seriously critical, but as you can see, it isn't received as the right sort of critique. It should also be clear that within the paradigm of critique, anomalies, as Kuhn would call them, have arisen. Not least the fact that its actual political effects have on the whole not been remarkable. I think the first sign of that was Bruno Latour's 2003, is it, essay, the one, what's it called? What Happened to Critique? Or something like that, where he points out that right-wingers have taken over some of the favored left-wing moves and so on. But so the question then is, are the current reading wars signs of emergence of the new? I'm not sure, because after all, new ideas may lose the struggle with the old, or they may turn out to not be as new as we first thought. But they at least raise the question of change and transformation and how it comes about. Or in other words, what will it take for practitioners of the old to be convinced by the new? Can proponents of different paradigms even have any kind of conversation? Or why does anyone ever change their mind? How does the new not just enter the world, but transform it? Talking about the sciences, Kuhn is not optimistic about the possibilities of change. Discussing the difficulties of what he calls conversion, he points to the sometimes complete impossibility of convincing proponents of the old paradigm of the claims of the new, and notes that sometimes the new paradigm only wins out when the practitioners of the old paradigm die. So young people will embrace the new. The old, you wait until they retire or die. That's a pretty dire vision. Now, this is, to my mind, Kuhn's book is so Wittgensteinian that, he wrote it in a time when he was talking to Stanley Cavell about Wittgenstein every day, and they both learned from each other all the time in the late 50s. So for me, Kuhn's observations on why conversions, he calls it a conversion experience when you suddenly see the new paradigm's beauties. That's because conversions aren't, and he has taken a lot of flack for that, isn't that irrationality and religious something? But I think it's Wittgenstein's paragraph 1 in the Investigations, explanations come to an end sometime. The reason I say that is that we all know that changing our minds is not something we do by pure rational logic alone. Wittgenstein also reminds us that when all the justifications are exhausted, then, and the others still can't or still won't see what we see, then there's nothing more we can do. My spade is turned, and he means nothing more you can do philosophically. That is, when that happens, what will you do? I always imagine and Wittgenstein has been criticized for quietism here, but I think that's also completely mistaken, because think about it, you spent all the powers you have to make someone see your point of view, and you've been rational and used philosophy and historical investigations. You've done everything, and still they won't see it the way you do. You cannot, I mean, the spade is turned, it's bent, you hit the bedrock. But what should he do? Whack the other over the head with the spade? That's like violence is what happens when you get too frustrated with this state of affairs. So the problem of conversion or the problem of conviction and change is a problem of the other. It's a problem of the self and the other, but it's also a problem that's not just literary and theoretical, but political and existential. So, thank you.